Good afternoon, everyone. We are just getting started. We're making sure the Facebook Live is up and running, and I believe it is. And we're going to just give people a moment to arrive. The participants is slowly but surely ticking up. And I think now is a good time to start. Well, good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the first OECD Washington Center DC Global Shapers Future of Work Interactive Dialogue Series event, Reskilling Underrepresented Communities for the Workforce. My name is Danny Ryan from the OECD Washington Center, and it's a huge thrill to launch our series today with such an esteemed panel. Our goal with these webinars is to discuss the policies, ideas, and actions that are shaping the future of work. Throughout this series, we will discuss reskilling, automation, entrepreneurship, education, and much more. For the first time ever, the OECD is putting young people at the heart of this discussion with our recently launched Youth Consultation, which aims to provide tools to better understand these issues and contribute to the conversation. So, if you are between 15 and 30, whatever your current situation or background may be, we would love if you would share your thoughts with us by taking part in our survey. Your opinions and ideas will help shape the OECD's advice to policymakers. This series also supports the World Economic Forum's Davos Labs initiative, topic area of economy. We will make sure to post links to both of these campaigns in the chat. Before we begin, I would like to give a big thank you to the DC Global Shapers for their enormous contribution to this series and for being, as ever, such a brilliant partner. And we're looking forward to continuing our work with them. We hope you enjoy today's event, and do please check out our next 3 webinars on March 17, March 31st, and April 14. With that being said, it gives me a huge pleasure to hand over to Sheila Kasasa, co-founder and CEO of Future First and a DC Global Shaper. We will first hear a presentation and then some remarks and then a panel discussion. And there will be opportunities to post questions in the Q&A as of now, so please start posting. Sheila, thank you so much for moderating today's session. I hand the floor over to you.
Okay, thank you so much, Danny, and to all of our panelists. This is a very timely conversation, and so I'm both inspired as well as empowered to be here with you all. And so I'm going to start with a little bit of background about myself. My name is Sheila Kasasa. I focus on entrepreneurship and tech opportunities for underserved communities. And this dream and vision came about by being a 3rd generation woman entrepreneur. My grandmother was an entrepreneur. My mother is an entrepreneur, and I'm an entrepreneur as well. And I'm a key example of what entrepreneurship and tech education can do for legacy building to bring an entire generation to the middle class. And so within that same breath, I'm just going to read just a quick little intro just to give you all an idea of the conversation we're going to be having today, then introduce my incredible panelists. And so with the digital divide widening across nations, underserved communities are on the brink of being left behind. With COVID, that fear is shifting into a reality. Communities and economists are calling for governments to improve education and train to help underserved communities create a pathway to skills needed for a digitally transformed future. With underserved communities experiencing racial, physical, or resource barriers, how can governments, companies, and organizations help reskill communities to tackle unemployment and meet the thousands of jobs that are still unfilled? Whose responsibility is it to reskill communities? What current trends show that reskilling during COVID for unemployment is focused on technology skills, which companies are equipping employees with professional development? This discussion will focus on who should step up to reskilling underserved communities and how would that pipeline of talent integrate into the current job market. I wanted to set the stage with that summary because our incredible panel is doing this work daily. They're either on the ground or they're creating strategies that are changing both communities and countries. And so I would first love to introduce Jasmine Tanner. She's a product manager for Wikipedia Android. She's with the Wikimedia Foundation, as well as the co-founder of Project C and a global shaper. I would also like to introduce you all to Katherine Morand. She's a program manager with Washington, DC, Department of Small and Local Business. Actually, I've done a lot of great work with both Jasmine and Kate in the last few years, and just watching their impact in the DC community has been just such an inspiration, and seeing ideas really transform communities. And we also have Patricia Mingol. Did I say that correctly, Patricia?
Yes, no worries.
Okay, awesome. And she's a policy analyst project lead in higher education for OECD. And her colleague is here as well, Andrea Mina, who's an analyst with OECD Center for Skills. And so like Danny said, we're going to start off with a few remarks from each panelist, and then we'll go into a discussion, panel discussion, and then end off with some Q&A. So if you have some great questions that you want to bring to the conversation, feel free to type them into the chat box, and that way we'll be able to break them up towards the end. So yeah, I would love to kick off with Patricia and Andrea, if you want to share your screens.
Hi, I think I will be going first. Thank you, Sheila, for the introduction. Just 1 second. Let me share my screen. Can you see? Is it fine? Yes. Okay, perfect. Thank you. Okay, so good afternoon, everyone, in a very virtual way. My name is Andrea Mina. I'm an analyst in the Directorate of Education and Skills at the OECD. And I will be providing you some insights on our work on the Skills Outlook 2019 on skills to thrive in a digital world. As you know, COVID-19 has put technology quite at the core of policy responses in many countries regarding for the pandemic. So raising new questions about the type of skills people need to thrive in a digital economy, but also in a digital society. And I think that our work on the Skills Outlook provides many interesting insights in this area. So in this publication, what was our aim was to understand how the role of skills, but also of skills related policies in making the most of the digital transformation, and how policies can best accompany workers and citizens while navigating many of the challenges. And while in the publication, we focused a lot on a range of skills that people need for the world of work and society, but also on how technology can provide many solutions in this respect by enhancing learning in a digital environment, I'll be mostly focusing my presentation on the skills required for a world of work, for an increasingly digital world of work. So there has been a lot of focus put on jobs at risk of automation. But what we show in this publication and in our work is that actually all occupations are being transformed by digitalization. More and more workers will be required to work with technology, and it's what we see also now currently with the pandemic. And our analysis, our analysis revealed, and as you can see also on this chart, that when the ICT intensity of jobs or the non-routine intensity increases, workers make greater use of cognitive skills such as reading or writing or advanced numeracy skills. In addition, more digital jobs also require executing a broader range of tasks. You do not see this on the chart, but our analysis showed that workers in more digital jobs also perform more communication or accounting tasks. So this illustrates the large complementarities actually between technology and workers and the importance of social emotional skills in the workplace. So to thrive in a digital world of work, ICT skills are not going to be enough, and other complementary skills need to be developed across all stages of learning and across life. Secondly, what I also wanted to emphasize in my presentation is that digitalization also heightens the need for workers to adapt and potentially transition to different occupations. And also experts expect that the pandemic is going to accelerate the reallocation of labor across sectors or across occupations. So what we have tried to do in our work is to assess how education and training policies can actually help workers change occupations and favor occupational mobility. And in particular, we looked at distances between occupations in terms of skill requirements and identified possible and acceptable transitions for workers. And what we can see, you see on this graph, is that actually most occupations appear to be fairly close to other occupations in terms of cognitive skill requirements, task content, and knowledge area. This is reflected in the fact that for almost all occupations, it is possible to identify possible transitions with a relatively small training effort, so that goes up to 6 months. Of course, more skilled occupations have more possible transitions, irrespective of the training effort, whereas for less skilled workers, a big career change would require larger investments in the training in order to be able to transition to other occupations. However, workers may be actually unwilling to move if moving to a different occupation entails very large wage losses or significant underuse or loss of skills. So therefore, we also focus on an analysis on what we call acceptable occupations. So occupations that entail only moderate wage losses and losses of skills. And such acceptable occupation transitions with that imply limited wage reductions and skill excesses can be identified for a much more limited number of occupations with a small training effort. And what you can see on this graph is actually that the likelihood of occupational mobility enabled by upskilling or reskilling efforts is bell-shaped. There are not many acceptable transitions from low-skilled occupations to other occupations because such transitions would involve quite large skill requirements. But in a similar vein, there are also not many acceptable transitions from high-skilled occupations to other occupations because these transitions would entail relatively big wage decreases or skills excesses. Of course, one important question for countries and not only is related to the cost. It's related to the cost, but I'm sorry, before I move to the cost, I would like to discuss a bit the fact that the risk of automation that has been put quite a lot at the focus of many discussions. So for a group of occupations, there is actually a large share of tasks that may be automatable that makes these occupations more at risk. So what we can see in our analysis is that actually more than half of occupations will need moderate to high training efforts to shield their workers from the risk of automation. This, of course, varies by country, and we have built clusters of countries in which we grouped countries in our analysis to see how this varies. For instance, the United States is in what we call cluster 2. In cluster 2, for instance, is a cluster of countries where worker skills are quite dispersed, and so occupations tend to be quite distant from one another in terms of skill requirements. Therefore, the training that is required to switch from one occupation to another is larger. So designing effective options of training and learning on the job is very crucial for this particular set of countries. And now moving to what I was mentioning earlier, one important question for countries and not only is that what is the actual cost of the upskilling or retraining of the workforce that is required, especially to shield workers from the risk of automation. And in our analysis, we have tried to estimate this cost by, and we see that these estimates range from 0.52% of GDP in countries like Norway to more than 10% of 1 year's GDP in Chile. These cost estimates include both the direct cost of training, but also the foregone cost of wages that are lost by workers when they engage in training instead of going to work. So to reduce the cost of the training effort, it is actually crucial that policies encourage working and learning at the same time. And one of the second policy implications of our analysis is to actually make the most also of the opportunities brought about by digitalization for learning. We observe that workers are actually more likely to maintain their skills in workplaces that are more exposed to digitalization. So policies can remove some of the barriers to technology adoption by firms and sectors that are lagging behind in order to be able to also help workers in the sectors keep their skills up with the others. Finally, our analysis tends to suggest that it is important that workers in occupations at high risk of automation also not only participate in education and training so that they're able to have more facility in occupational mobility and moving to what we call a safe haven, so occupations with a low risk of automation. But one recurrent problem that we see for these workers and for less skilled workers in general is that they are less likely to participate in training. So there are a number of policy options that we emphasize in our analysis in order to address this issue relating to overcoming the barriers that prevent adults in engaging in training. So creating flexible and shorter types of training, better recognizing prior learning. But also, I think the focus needs also to be put on the type of content of the training that is provided. Our analysis show, for instance, that to help workers move away from the risk of automation, training is needed in a wide range of skills, not just ICT skills. There is a need of training for cognitive skills, but also for social and emotional skills related to management, communication, self-organization. So there's not only a question of engaging these adults much more in training, but it also about the type of training that is provided to them. So with that said, I would like to finish here since the time is very short, and I'm available for any questions at the end of the presentation in case you want me to come back to any of the points that I raised. So thank you very much, and I will hand over to Patricia.
Thank you very much. So I will go ahead now. That's okay. I'm going to share my screen as well. Is that okay? Can you see it? Okay. So good afternoon, everyone. I'm very happy to be here with you today. And my name is Patricia Mengel. I work in the OECD Higher Education Policy team. So what I will do today is present to you some of the work we have done recently that is relevant to the discussion that we are having today. So following up on my colleague Andrea's presentation, one of the key questions is how to help individuals to reskill. This is a question that is before us because of technological change. It's also even more the case with the pandemic. So what I will talk to you about today briefly is 3 points. First, I will have a look at the US context a bit more specifically because we have done recent work on the US, and I want to show that education in the US really drives labor market success even more than in other OECD countries. Secondly, I want to speak to you a little bit about analysis that we've done about the skills that employers require, because of course, if we're talking about training, like Andrea said, we need to make sure that the training is relevant to the labor market needs. And finally, just a quick note on perhaps something that could spark discussion about the potential role of alternative credentials in supporting training. So here I'm starting with a few simple points from our analysis on 4 US states. So what we did is we actually looked at the outcomes of people who completed higher education in 4 US states. And we had some look as well at the sort of the national outlook compared to other OECD countries. Here, what you see is quite simply that in the US, if you don't have a higher education degree, the chances of being employed are quite low. They're actually lower in the US than in other OECD countries. So higher education, a higher level of skills is particularly important in a labor market such as the one in the US. That's true for the employment rate. It's also true for earnings. So what you can see here is that the earnings are really quite substantially higher the minute you have a higher level of degree. Not surprising, but what I would like to emphasize is just the difference between what you see in the US and what you see on average in the OECD. So here again, we see, and that's related to the nature of the labor market in the US, but education plays a key role. And we need to keep in mind the importance of the degree still today for the employers in the US. Now, I want to give a couple of points on demographic groups. So regarding gender, we wanted to see what is the situation in the US compared to the OECD on average in terms of gender differences. Once again, looking at the graduates, people that have completed higher education, and here we're talking about bachelor graduates, so people with a 4-year degree. What you can see is that unsurprisingly, we have a gap between men and women, and that's something that I'm sure you would expect. You do see that both men and women are more employed, graduates are more employed in the US and in the OECD. And I do draw your attention to the fact that women are actually quite a little bit more employed than their counterparts in other countries, which is a positive message here. Now, on the actual earnings, the message is a little bit less positive. You see quite a large gap between men and women, and that's pretty much the same between the US and what we see in the rest of the OECD. Now, I want to provide some information about our findings regarding labor market outcomes of people who are from different races and ethnicities. We don't have this data for OECD countries, but we have it for the US. So we just wanted to look at what is the situation for different groups, looking here at 3 groups, white graduates, Hispanic and Latino graduates, and Black African American graduates. what you see is that when it comes to employment outcomes, actually there is a bit of a difference, but it's not substantive. You see that a few percentage points difference, but really like there's not too much difference. When you look at the annual median earnings, on the other hand, there you can see that underrepresented groups continue to face penalties in the labor market, even with a similar, actually the same level of education. So that's something we wanted to highlight in our study. What we also highlight, which I think is quite important to keep in mind, is that when we're talking about the level of education, or when we're talking about how different groups fare in the labor market, we also need to look exactly at what people have studied, what knowledge and skills they have developed. And I go back to the point Andrea made earlier, what people are actually learning matters tremendously to their outcomes. And that's true even if we know that many people, many graduates, for example, of higher education go to work in different fields. However, what they have studied really determines how well they do. And here on this slide, I show you 4 states because those are the ones we focused on in our work. And it sort of like illustrates the earning premium that a graduate earns compared to someone who has just finished high school in 4 different fields of study. You won't be surprised, graduates from STEM, science, technology, engineering, and mathematics, and ICT tend to earn a lot more than people that graduate, for example, from education and arts and humanities. But what you can see on this chart is that the gap between the field of study is bigger in states like Virginia and Washington. And what we think is a possible explanation for that is because these states have a very, very technologically driven economy. So there is probably a higher shortage in those states when it comes to STEM and ICT graduates. So there, the message is we also need to look at where people are, what is the nature of the economy in which, the labor market in which they are situated. And now I want to move to another point, which is based on work we have done using online job postings data. So we actually analyzed 9 million job postings posted in the 4 US states that I just mentioned before between 2010 and 2018 in order to look at what kinds of skills employers are requiring of higher education graduates, wanting to understand what are employers actually requiring of those graduates that they want to hire. So what we did is that we looked at skills in very different categories. When you look at those job postings, there are thousands and thousands and thousands of skills that are listed by employers. So we organize them in 3 main categories: cognitive skills, for example, critical thinking or quantitative reasoning; social emotional skills, for example, conscientiousness or collaboration, open-mindedness, as well as technical transferable skills. And those are, for example, management or ICT skills. These are technical in nature, but they can be used in different occupations. And we oppose in a certain way, we understand those skills as transferable, all of these 3 categories, and we sort of compare them to those very technical but job-specific skills, those skills that are really specific to the particular occupation in which the job posting is referring to. And what we did is that we wanted, and I'm showing you here just one example of our paper, we wanted to look at what happens when employers, for example, in ICT are looking for people to fill jobs, but they don't have enough people that maybe have an ICT degree. Well, what we did is we looked at those job postings in the ICT occupations, and we looked at the ones that actually where the employers require a specific field of study, where they actually make that explicit in their posting. And we saw that 60% of the job postings in ICT welcome applicants from other fields of study. So that was an interesting surprise for us, which means that they're open to other graduates. Of course, then when you look at what graduates they're looking for, it's quite narrow. So they're looking for maybe people from engineering, from management, marketing, and other support services, or from mathematics and statistics. Still, it means that maybe there are people with different degrees that could fill the roles in ICT. And also what we want to emphasize is that almost all of these job postings require advanced ICT skills. Of course, again, unsurprising, but that's something that actually is quite relevant because perhaps some of those advanced ICT skills might be something that people can acquire without going through a full degree, and perhaps using some short modular training opportunities that would enable them to actually access those occupations. Which leads me to my last slide here, and this is from another paper that we published, which is related to alternative credentials. So alternative credentials are a form of credential that may be considered as an alternative to post-secondary education programs. So we're talking about credentials of different types. They can be shorter, they can be a little bit longer, they can be delivered by universities and colleges or by employers. They can be industrial certifications, they can be digital badges, they can be a lot of different things, but what matters is that they are actually signaling a skill that somebody actually has. And in our paper, we discussed the place of those alternative credentials in the future of work. Are these going to be just something on the side of post-secondary qualifications? Like I said in the beginning of our presentation, the degree still matters a lot for employment and earnings. So what is going to happen with those credentials? Do they have a role to play? Are they going to be actually a complement where employers will want both? Perhaps employers will want a degree as well as an alternative credential that perhaps signals a particular skill or an ability to upskill over time. Or, of course, we can think about it in a sort of bigger picture and think, well, perhaps in the COVID-19 situation, a lot of people will be needing to upskill without having the means to engage in a full-blown higher education program. And in certain cases, we could ask, are there some industries, some occupations where they could become an actual substitute to post-secondary qualifications? So with that, I leave you with the resources of the documents I spoke about. And again, very happy to take any questions when we go to the discussion session. Thank you very much.
Awesome. Thank you so much. I would love to go and to our next panelist, and that's Jasmine, if you want to give us a few remarks.
Sure, yeah, thanks, Sheila, and thanks for that presentation. It was great. I think I might use some of that to answer some of the questions later. So just to give folks a little bit of context, I am from the area. I grew up both between Prince George's County and Maryland, DC, and I was the first person in my family to work in technology. My lineage goes sharecroppers for paid employment, housekeepers, cooks, hospital staff, administrative assistants, and social workers. And unfortunately for social workers in DC during the time that my family first started working in it, they were paid no more than $25,000. And this is with an undergraduate degree. That's on my mother's side. On my father's side, it's a line of entrepreneurs and similar blue and pink collar jobs to my mom's lineage. And due to low income circumstances, fast tracking some of the people in my family from the school to prison pipeline, and a lack of opportunities for people re-entering society after that is one of the reasons that they went into entrepreneurship. In middle school, I dared to dream of becoming the president one day. This was before Obama was president. I know I seem young, but I just want to give that preface. But later on, once I got to high school, I thought being president might be a little too rough of a job. And so I started to try and figure out what else I wanted to do. By a stroke of luck, when spending time with a friend, I stumbled across a program called the Leaders of Tomorrow program. And this is a program by the National Black MBA, as in Masters in Business Administration program. And this was my first exposure to Black professionals working in business and technology. In that program, we learned oratorical skills, how to analyze an MBA level case, the importance of community service, college prep. So we received training for the SAT and we received mentors. It was a program that literally changed my life. I went from being a freshman in high school in my first semester, having a 2.0 GPA, to receiving a 4.2 GPA by my senior year. I used the network to negotiate obtaining a marketing internship at Georgetown University here in DC, which was another stroke of luck. This is because those internships were reserved for college students. I took the SAT 4 times, despite having a 4.2 GPA, because that's how many times it took in order for me to get a score high enough for me to go into college. And by the time I graduated from VCU, I had worked 7 jobs. I landed a job as a marketer, and I worked that job for about a year. While I was in college, there was someone that remembered a speech that I gave where I said that I wanted to go into consulting, like one of my mentors, because representation matters. And so I got invited to an interview. I originally interviewed for strategic communications, And I was actually onboarded into IT project management, where I got on the job training for that. So another stroke of luck. At the time, I was volunteering for Compass Consulting, giving pro bono consulting work. And I was also the chair of Leaders of Tomorrow to give back to the organization that gave back to me. But I noticed a gap. The gap that I noticed, I filled by creating Project Z. I wanted to take some of the things that I learned from Leaders of Tomorrow, which was professional development, public speaking, soft skills, mentorship, networking, pair that with the things that students got from the Marion Barry Summer Youth Employment Program, which still operates today in DC, which is job readiness and receiving payment, as well as apply to some of the things I learned from the World Economic Forum as it regards to the future of work and what jobs will be available in the future, and some of the unique needs of Black youth and those most at risk in DC, which were wraparound services. So Project Z takes cohorts of students and put them in groups based on an assessment. It pairs them with mentors. They receive training on the job, and they work on projects for real companies, and they receive payment. So as I started to fill the gap for some of those students, I needed to fill the gap for myself. And I wanted to work for a mission-driven company, which I found a perfect opportunity for that by working at the Wikimedia Foundation, originally as a technical program manager. And I've since shifted, as Sheila mentioned earlier, into product management for the Android platform. So I now run Project Z while working at Wikimedia to support a world where everyone can share the sum of all knowledge. We aren't quite there yet, but we are on the right track. Sheila, in the prompt, you mentioned the pandemic. Wikimedia has always been remote, so it's an element that I bring to Project Z by leveraging open source tools. And at the time, it was hybrid working between remote and in person. That flexibility promoted equity, and we still had guardrails in place for accountability and collaboration. These are the types of measures that are important, especially during COVID, being adaptable, flexible, and providing remote options. But also, these are practices underserved communities will need to have once the pandemic is over and people go back into offices.
Thank you so much, Jasmine. And again, these are the conversations I know I have with you all the time as a partner, as well as with Kate. And it actually is a great transition into Kate. We would love to hear a few remarks from you as well, just as a government partner and also pioneering in all the work you're navigating in DC right now during COVID.
Thanks, Sheila. Thank you. And thanks for everyone who's listening today. And I'm just going to give a few remarks about the importance of lacing entrepreneurship into workforce training, which I think that the work that both Sheila and Jasmine are doing are key examples of how that can and should work. We'll talk a little bit about how we've gotten involved in that from the Department of Small and Local Business Development. But off the top, I will say some of the importance about that connection between entrepreneurship and workforce is helping to bring the entrepreneurial mindset into workforce training. And what that really does is it adds resilience, capacity, and wealth building potential for the medium and long term for anyone who is going through workforce training. I'm going to walk through a couple of key programs. One is called our Aspire to Entrepreneurship program. One is our Build a Dream program. And I'm going to culminate in talking about the program that we partnered with Future First, where Sheila is, called the CU. And how these are all related and how they all drive towards supporting people in entrepreneurship, whether they're going to start something now, whether they're going to start something later, whether they're going to tell a family member and a family member is going to know how to do that, but what it means.
Kate, sorry not to cut your microphone.
Oh, can you hear?
Yeah.
Okay, I'll make sure I lean in just a little bit more, and my apologies. But I'll tell you just briefly who I am. My name is Kate Morand, and for the last 5 years, I've been operating the Innovation and Equitable Development team at the Department of Small and Local. It didn't exist before 5 years ago. My background in entrepreneurship is actually that I grew up in a family business that continues to today. It was a family farm, but also arts and crafts. And I would say through that experience was really able to understand how important it is to the human psyche to be able to dream, to be able to take agency into building what you want to build and what you want to see in the world. And that a lot of what entrepreneurship is about and a lot of what we see from our entrepreneurs is that they're changing the world and they need help and support to do that. It might take them 10 to 30 years to do it, but it's something that they will continue to build throughout that time. So this work started, and I'll say, just talk about this program briefly. The Aspire to Entrepreneurship program in Washington, D.C. is 5 years old. It is a program to support returning citizens, individuals who have a criminal record, into opening their own business. And that started as a specific partnership with our workforce agency at the Department of Employment Services. And it was important for many reasons in the district, both as an opportunity for those who are going through workforce training, also as an opportunity to understand how workforce training can fund this work, that becomes very important, but also in recognizing that returning citizens may face some of the most barriers that anyone faces to be able to start their own business, but really need that support. As workforce can be unstable for some people, particularly if you are facing collateral consequences or other things, there may be times in your workforce journey where you need to figure out how to do things on your own. But the other piece that's important about that as well, and as we've learned from many of the returning citizens who've come through our programs, many returning citizen-owned companies are the ones who are going to hire other returning citizens. And then there's a key phrase that comes from that we've learned, which is called each one teach one. And that phrase means that as you are supporting someone in a community, they're supporting others in their community as well. And we know that a lot of people really are striving to open a business for a lot of different reasons. Sometimes it is for the money. Most of the time it is not for the money, although we want people to be economically stable and want them to be able to build wealth. We've trained over 3,000 entrepreneurs in DC in our training called Build a Dream. It's a 10-hour training about how and why to do entrepreneurship. And the reasons that people bring forward are usually because they want to make a change in their community or they want to make a change in their life. And this is how they're going to approach doing it. And so Aspire was a 6-month business incubator that partnered with Project Empowerment in DC that provided a stipend. And that was important for the work that we were doing so that people had an ability to spend time on building their entrepreneurship. But the other thing that really came out of Aspire was a strong interest in supporting youth. And as we worked with returning citizens of all ages, the one consistent thing that we heard from the returning citizen population that was working with us is that they want to support and help youth. So that youth have opportunities to build wealth, to maintain jobs and to do other pieces. And that really led us to thinking about what DC Youth Corps was for a couple of years. And that's a program that was operated by Future First. DC Youth Corps was a partnership with the Marion Barry Summer Youth Employment Program. It was an add-on, but it was really recognizing that, sort of the future of work that we were seeing in DC was a lot of tech jobs. And if you wanted to get into a tech job, you would need tech training. But if you want to work in a tech startup, you probably need to understand that entrepreneurial mindset. And that might work a lot better if you were dreaming about the possibility of opening your own tech startup one day, which is very possible. And so within that partnership, which had support through workforce to pay stipends so that people had time, it was really a combination between entrepreneurship training, in-classroom tech training, but also on-the-job experience in different roles in those tech companies. And so it's a combined model of being able to say, how are we learning? How are we doing? How are we dreaming? And then I think one key piece that was really important was additional wraparound services if someone was facing additional challenges. And I think that, that model continues to change shape. And I know it's continuing to today with different partners and different ways forward. But I think the key point here is that we've really found that entrepreneurship exposure can strengthen a workforce experience, whether or not someone is going to stay in that job or work to do something else, because they're going to be thinking more about how does this whole thing operate? Why does this whole thing operate? What can I be learning from this outside of what I'm just doing in my current job, so that people can really be dreaming for the future.
Incredible. And that's really powerful, how we always have to create opportunities for public-private partnerships, right? With our partnership with DSLBD and Project Z, DOES, Department of Employment Services, and a few other agencies, in 3 years have been able to impact over 600 young people between 15 to 24. Actually, a few of them work at Amazon. Recently checked in, Kate, I'll send you a little bit of that. So it's great to see community champions like yourself working with organizations like ours. So thank you for that. And since I have your attention here, I would love to first start with a quote before I jump into questions. But I love this quote by Dr. King, and the quote is, "The function of education is to teach one to think intensively and to think critically. Intelligence plus character, that is the goal for true education." In all of the work we're doing, OECD is our partner on this conversation, and our work we're doing as well on the ground. We have to keep this in mind, right? We have to humanize these experiences, leading with empathy first. We know this works, and we have to maintain that trajectory forward. So, okay, what are some permanent shifts with COVID? Will COVID bring to DC in its efforts to train and reskill locals? I know you're seeing this in both the agency side as well as the different programs that you're still managing.
Yeah, I mean, I think from small and local business perspective, we're seeing a few different key trends. I mean, I think we all know that there are major hits to the economy in hotels. We're seeing that in retail. And what is that going to mean as those physical properties shift, and what might people be doing in those spaces? And so I think that we are seeing a few different trends. One is an excitement about makers and making continues to grow. And, you know, if someone is going to build a skill for something like that, how does that integrate and collaborate in different ways? But I also think the other conversation that I haven't mentioned yet that I think is growing, there's a lot of conversation about cooperatives, about worker-owned cooperatives, about business-owned cooperatives. What does cooperative economics mean for people who want to build wealth and maybe do that together? And so that has been coming on the landscape more and more. Community advocates are pushing it pretty heavily. And so, I mean, I think there's a lot of rethinking the fundamental tenets of like how we assumed the economy worked are starting to look different. We don't quite know where it's going to land, but we know certain sectors are going to change dramatically. Again, that's retail, probably things around tourism, but even the use of space. And I think that the use of space will really drive how a lot of the other places work, because office space is coming down. People aren't going to use as much office space. Retail space is going to be different. And what it really requires is creative folks to say, now what are we going to do with this resource?
Okay, I love the conversation about space, right? WeWork was a very big champion in the DC community, and other co-working spaces as well, that were creating opportunities for the community to come together, share ideas, and yeah, we see a lot of these spaces closing. And so just out of curiosity, have you seen any other cities or states that have taken on taken on, how do I rephrase this? Have taken on COVID head on, and how do you think DC can take these same examples and create some kind of actionable steps? Sorry, I'm losing my words today. Actionable steps to be able to transform its community.
Yeah, I mean, I think we hear best practices in bits and pieces from different cities. There's always a lot of activity in New York City, and so we know that they have been supporting cooperatives pretty heavily. We've also been hearing from the other Made In programs across. I mentioned makers. We also support the Made in DC program, and so we've been hearing a lot about bringing light manufacturing into downtown corridors, making that visible, making that something that people can interact with in a different way. And so those best practices are starting to trickle in. But I think one thing that might be I think tech is rising everywhere, but I think pre-pandemic, Washington, DC recognized that the number of tech jobs that would be coming online would be pretty high compared even to the rest of the country, because we have the seat of the federal government here and a huge need for that. So I think that that's one thing that we probably need to strike out and figure out how to be a leader in that space, because we still have the number of jobs here, even if they might be dispersing somewhat, and the need for that here compared to other cities' level of need for filling tech jobs.
Okay, thank you so much for that. Jasmine, taking it over to you. So with Project Z, again, incredible organization. that actually works in reskilling locals in DC, and you're a DC resident yourself. Can you tell us a bit about programming and the necessary wraparound services organizations and tech companies need to have before engaging underserved youth as it relates to the workforce and workforce development in general?
Yeah, thanks, Sheila. So Project Z has served hundreds of students, and we seek to close the skills gap for youth facing social and economic barriers, right? So how many students, I think we should contextualize what that really is. And so that's 47% of students in school as defined by DC government. Of those at-risk students, only 56% of them are graduating from DC public schools, which is high school. So that's something I think to remember to link back to what Patricia shared earlier about the linkage between education and employability. There are some discrepancies as well within race, gender, and if English is a first language for a student. This is important in a city where the students enrolled here are 59% Black, 20% Hispanic, 16% white, and 5% Asian, multiracial, or another race. So what exactly are those barriers? Those barriers are working low-wage jobs while also trying to obtain an education, or sometimes having to choose between a formal education and working if employment is even an option. Dealing with traumas that come with living in an over-policed, low-income environment, maybe experiencing homelessness, or dealing with inequity and injustice due to race, gender, sexuality, or ability without the proper healthcare support to deal with those traumas. Not having effective guidance counselors, sponsors, or mentors to advise students on their career path for a sustained period of time, or living in food insecure places and not having the quality nutrition, often enroll in TANF or SNAP. So the things that Project Z provides is mentors that commit to helping students advance to whatever the next stage of their development is for a minimum of a year. Often schools are understaffed, and if they even do have a guidance counselor, it's one guidance counselor for many students with many ambitions. And counselors aren't always given the resource to connect students with people in their field. I also want to mention not all students graduate from high school, as I mentioned, as we saw with those statistics. So they should still have an opportunity at employment. So we provide students training while they're actually getting the work experience with real companies, like a consulting model. They get actual face time with these companies so that they can learn entrepreneurial skills should they go into the gig economy. They have formal trainers for technical and soft skills, and they can follow up with their mentors for any deepening that they need to do. They're paid above the DC minimum wage as an incentive to not have to work at other jobs, but also given the flexibility in case they do need to work another job or care for family members. And we realize, formalized education is not for everyone. And so we give them access to additional boot camps if necessary, or teach them to be an entrepreneur and register their business. Students have sustained lunch breaks, and we sometimes supplement meals that provides quality nutritional value. We break the students up into cohorts so they learn team building skills. And then we partner with organizations like Future First and New Earth in Los Angeles that provide access to mental health resources. These are all services I think should honestly one day be integrated within DCPS schools itself, in addition to these private and public partnerships. When we have the services, it results in people like Michael Boudou, who was able to become an independent developer and now teaches at coding boot camps. Shayla Giles, who went on to go to a historically Black college and university called Hampton University, who was studying cybersecurity and criminal justice. She's using the skills as well to earn income while she's in college. Or Elisha, who landed a job as a software engineer at JP Morgan after the program with support in the interview process from his mentor and a fellow global shaper, Jeff Kangar. So these are just some of the things things that services that should be brought in to address those barriers.
I love that you said that. It's integrating wraparound services. It should be required for all programs. It's an easy hit or miss, and when we do not, again, put humans at the forefront of the conversation, we really miss that opportunity on touching these young people early on. And so I know that Wikimedia has sponsored Project Z in so many different ways. And can you tell us what role Wikipedia will play in education and development going forward? And in what ways does Wikipedia make its platforms accessible and user-friendly?
Yeah, great question. So the students in Project Z worked on something called the Open Source Design Kit for the Wikimedia Foundation, and they were able to get exposure to designers. And this was some of the students' first time ever working with UX designers. So that was great. With Wikipedia being open source, there's a lot of ways that people can leverage and learn for free, which is important. There's the traditional ways like reading our contribution. We have 53, sorry, I don't think I know where that's coming from. Sorry about that. Excuse me one second.
This is the remote world we're in, so we completely understand.
Yes, there we go. So yeah, there's the traditional ways. We have 53 million articles across 300 languages covering architecture to zoology. The pillars for education on Wikipedia is promoting knowledge equity, which aligns with the United Nations SDG 4. We teach 21st century skills for the Wikimedia Foundation, which is leveraging things like talk pages to learn to debate how a topic should be represented and why. And then there's reading Wikipedia in the classroom, which recently trained 1,000 teachers to leverage the skills on Wikipedia to promote reading in the classroom. So those are some of the ways. There's also some unconventional ways as well, which Project Z has leveraged, like fixing bugs, because volunteer developers can commit code. As it relates to accessibility, it's actually explicitly stated as a value for the foundation. We have technical standardizations we put in place to ensure there's accessibility for visually impaired people. There's 300 languages we represent, so that's language accessibility. And I can tell you as a product manager, something that's pretty unique about Wikipedia compared to other big tech is I read all of the reviews that come through the Google Play stores, all of the emails, all of the feedback, and respond as much as possible to actually include some of the things that people are saying that they need, whether it's bug fixes or feature requests. And this is true of other product teams at the foundation. We have access to desktop, mobile web, iOS, KaiOS, which is an important one because that's for low bandwidth areas. Those are like the type of devices that are used in a lot of emerging markets. And finally, we have new exciting projects like Newcomer Task that allows people to contribute to Wikipedia in small micro contributions, which is also something available on Android devices. And we're changing the way Wikipedia looks so that it becomes more modern through a project called Desktop Refresh.
That's amazing. It's always great when you have big tech at the forefront of engaging the next generation and other generations as well. So thank you for that. So Andrea or Patricia, whoever wants to answer this, we're talking about the US a lot and we're loving the conversation about the US, but we would love to know, is there a country in the OECD network that has a structured reskilling program that can act as a model for other countries, and what makes it successful? Either or.
Can I Patricia, or do you prefer going first, or?
You could go ahead, Andrea, and I'll just follow up if you want.
Okay, thank you. So just very, very quickly, because for the skills outlook, we actually had a look at how countries perform in terms of providing lifelong learning options to workers and citizens. And one of the strands of the work was to actually look at the performance of lifelong learning systems in different countries and see which countries are performing better, looking at a variety of indicators in terms of how individuals participate in learning at different stages in life, what is the quality of the training options provided from initial education to adult learning, but also in terms of equity, what is the impact of the socioeconomic background on the outcomes people get from this, from participation in education and training. And we see that some countries tend to perform much better to perform very well on these dimensions, not a lot of them. So it's typically countries from Northern Europe like Denmark or Norway, but also a few other countries, for instance, New Zealand or Canada, perform very well in some of these dimensions. But most of the other countries tend to perform relatively unequally across these different dimensions of participation, equity, and quality of learning throughout the different stages of life. And what is also important when we relate this performance in terms of lifelong learning with countries with the digitalization, because what we were interested in it was also to look at what are the type of skills that we need for a digital society and how are countries performing with respect to preparing workers and citizens throughout life for digital transformation. So we see that countries that tend to perform relatively well in these dimensions are also countries where the adoption of technologies at work, but also in society, is much larger. Whereas countries that are slightly lagging behind with respect to their performance in lifelong learning systems and providing performant lifelong learning systems to their citizens tend to also to be countries that have lower adoption of digital tools at work, but also in the individual's everyday life. So this is from me. Patricia, if you want to add.
Thank you, Andrea. Yes, I think you're making a very important point because, you know, like we are looking at all the OECD countries and trying to look at how they're doing in different dimensions, and no country is perfect. I think that's a very important message. But at the same time, what Andrea is mentioning is what we see, for example, in Northern European countries, or in countries that I think the US could learn from perhaps more easily, like Canada, for example, which is like obviously a neighbor, so there's things to learn, is that there is a strong involvement, I think, of different types of stakeholders. I think one of the things that we see is a lot of support from the government. So there is a sort of a financing background that's very important to actually enable some sustainable training programs, but also a lot of collaboration with employers. And we see that in Northern European countries, where there is a lot of tradition of working together to shape training programs. But I would say also in the example of Canada, what's interesting is the community colleges, which are similarly structured as those in the US, take a really leadership role in working with employers to develop training programs that are very relevant. And they actually are targeting a population that typically is having challenges of various sorts in their personal life, in their academic record. So they are open access. And I think that would be something that is quite useful to look at the Kenyan system as one example. But we see that also in some other countries that really try to bring together different stakeholders to try and create programs that can be sustainable and that can actually sort of multifaceted, because I hear you all mention and I think it's very relevant, all these wraparound supports and some of these structured programs where institutions work with employers and with community organizations can actually do these different facets really well. Like it needs to be a kind of a collective effort. I do want to sort of maybe take the opportunity, and Andrea, maybe if you want to compliment too, but I see some questions in the chat addressed to us. There was a couple of points about whether the OECD has looked at the employer, the firm's investment in training and what that means for education. And I think there we do have some resources, and we'll be happy to share. Maybe Danny could share afterwards some resources. But we have looked in some of our publications as the way employers are actually contributing to training. And I think what we see is that often in countries that have a lot of investment from employers, it's also the countries that have a lot of investment from governments. And I think that's what Andrea was saying as well about, you know, where you see a lot of like digitalization, you tend to also see a lot of training and participation in training. So there seems to be a need to invest on multiple fronts. And I think that when we see the employer investment, the government also needs to you know, play its part in some ways. And there was another question about what we see with COVID. And the problem with COVID is that government budgets are shrinking, and there are a lot of demands coming from all sorts of sectors, health in particular, of course, also social supports. But there's also a need to sustain investment in training, and that's something we're not so sure yet. It's too early to tell, but we can see in our data that during the 2008 crisis, government spending in areas which are related to training have actually been constrained. And in higher education as well, they have actually gone down. So it's something to take into account that for the recovery, government might need to continue considering these areas as crucial. I don't know, Andrea, if you want to add anything.
Yeah, thank you. I mean, I think the point about the involvement of, private sector actors and also social partners is important. Also, with respect to the analysis that we've been performing around the cost of training for reskilling workers and encouraging mobility across occupations, because a lot of this cost comes also from the fact that many workers have to combine, have to combine work and learning to be able to reskill, and therefore the role of employers and of social partners becomes crucial. And we have a number of resources at the OECD, for instance, in the priority. In the dashboard for the priorities for adult learning, you have quite a lot of resources regarding the financing of adult learning, and of course, I mean, there are a lot of gaps in this type of data that has not been collected systematically. And at the OECD, we've done efforts at trying to fill these gaps with the different data sources. But and models can also very much differ between different countries with respect to what is the healthy mix of investments in adult learning. So this is still an open question and a debate that remains with respect to how adult learning should be financed, and what is the exact proportion of investments coming from these different actors in this healthy mix of funding adult learning.
So we also did touch on, and thank you for that, we did touch on alternative credentialing, right? Do you all believe that that organizations and institutions should have incentives from government to maybe pivot from traditional education, right? Where we've seen a shift of budgets for universities, we've seen a shift of budgets for schools throughout the globe. Will some kind of incentive be helpful? Patricia, if you want to take that aside.
Sure. Yeah, I think the question of alternative credentials is a very interesting one, because at this time we are still trying to understand what they are and how can they be quality opportunities for people. So I think the idea of whether pivoting from traditional programs to alternative credential programs really has to consider the issue of the quality that is being delivered and to make sure that the actual incentive is well used. So I think at this stage it's a little too early to tell yet whether it is really a something that can be considered. I think at this point what would be really useful is first to start and try to establish a taxonomy of what those alternative credentials are, and then being able to understand them, to compare them, and to see whether employers actually see value in them. I think that the validation on the value, which is from the employer side, but perhaps also from professional trainers like higher education institutions, would really help move in that direction.
Sheila, could I add something on that?
Of course, yeah.
So, I mean, I think one of the things that we would point out from the small business perspective, in the US, 47% of the workforce is employed by small employers. One of the things that we've been hearing from small businesses in regards to sort of federal workforce supports is those are much better attuned to large employers. But by creating a better communication in ways for small businesses to access training, conversations on what those credentialing should be, funding that comes through those spaces, you might see an organic sort of development of that discussion. And I would just encourage anyone working on that to keep that in mind, that your small businesses may be able to help you without having funding to pivot, still help you pivot that in a very positive way.
I like that you said that, because we're also seeing the same, we're seeing the same, right? With our partnership with Department of Employment Services, there has been a shift of what skills can we give young people to be able to just hit the workforce as soon as possible, right? But again, back to Jasmine's conversation, is we can't even get there if we cannot provide simple wraparound services. So I personally, just out of bias, I do think we do have to challenge the conversation of creating incentives for programs to be able to work with these populations. We also work with senior citizens, and if you start looking at that data, it's very scary. It's really very scary. And what does it look like to reskill underserved communities, and specifically senior citizens? And what does the access to the workforce look like post-COVID? And so I love, we're almost to the end of our great conversation. I'd love to keep you guys for coffee. I would love to open this up for all of you all, and that's the audience. Again, feel free to keep popping in there with some questions. I love to leave conversations with tangible next steps or ideas, food for thought that we can all take. We have about 35 participants left on here, but this is also being shared on Facebook. So who do you all think, just put your different hats on if you have to shift them, but who do you all think should take a step up to reskill underserved communities, and how would that pipeline of talent actually integrate into the current job market? I addressed this in the beginning, but now that we're all warmed up to each other, I would love to hear your perspectives. Anyone can go first, not calling any names, but.
You go first, Katherine.
Okay, I'll jump in, and I think it's a similar point to what I just made, but a lot of what we look at is how do you build capacity for communities to provide that training? And I think one of the things that we've seen every time, if we're working with universities or other spaces, they're always trying to get that connection to community so that they can do a better job. And so I think part of the layer that needs to happen is saying, we need to train the trainers, and we need to know that those trainers have real, authentic, and deep, like just sort of engagement with their communities already. And what does that mean to do that? That is a critical layer of this retraining.
Jasmine, do you want to jump in?
Yeah, great point. Just to build on that, I think it's imperative that everyone takes responsibility to reskill underserved communities. I think we're all responsible. And I think it has to be a partnership between private and public sector. Services need to be available within schools, not just charter schools, and also outside of schools as well. I think that we also need to center grassroots organizations that are led by people from those communities, and as well as people that have delivered results. Because they do have the capability to move faster and be a little more innovative than maybe the government does. So in order for that to happen, I think the government, I will speak specifically to DC, will need to make it easier for these organizations to exist. Project Z was started with $2,000 out of pocket. And it was ridiculously hard to get a 501c3 in order to get grant funding. And now, we'll receive roughly $60,000 in grants and donations, but that was very hard to get to. And that's still $60,000 to serve a lot of students is pretty scrappy. So I think my last final points are also that there needs to be a partnership between juvenile detention centers for students upon re-entry as well, because I think sometimes we leave those students out of conversations. COVID has further devastated underrepresented communities and put them even more at risk without access to any insurance. So they're on the front lines of gig economies and jobs where they have to be around people. The story I shared at the beginning had a lot of strokes of personal luck. And so if we don't want to leave it to luck and we want to have systemic change, then it requires all sectors at all levels to be invested and work together in order to reskill the labor market, especially those that are being left out.
Thank you for that. Patricia, any remarks?
Well, I just agree with my fellow panelists here. I mean, I think this is it's a tricky issue. So all partners have some role to play. I mean, in the OECD, we're looking in particular at the role of government, and I really take Jasmine's point around the challenge of slowness in terms of like, meeting new needs. And in the report we wrote about the US, we're looking at how governments can support the responsiveness of higher education to the labor market. And there in this area, a lot of the time, what we are saying is that the government has a role when it comes to providing a supportive regulatory environment. So for example, facilitating access to the right status to be able to actually receive donations, as you were just describing. So the facilitation aspect, it has a funding role, and that's what we're also recommending, like the ways to use funding and using constrained funding in a very relevant way, sort of using skills anticipation tools to make sure that funding goes towards a training that is relevant. And that's a role that government should be taking. So of course, all the players have to be involved, like I said before, but from our perspective, I think we would emphasize some of these really critical success conditions the government has to put forward.
Andrea?
Yeah, if I can add on that and maybe come back a bit earlier to people's lives, to initial education, because we've been talking a lot about coordinated effort between actors especially for adult training. But I mean, to be able to reskill and upskill workers, there is a need for foundation in terms of cognitive skills, and not only. And the role of initial education is crucial in this respect. And now with COVID, we've seen that it's not just schools, and that people do not learn only in schools, but they learn a lot outside of schools. And for instance, when you think about the role of parents, but also local communities and the type of exchanges that happen there. So there is definitely much more scope of thinking about the role of initial education in its cooperation with what happens outside of formal education, and with the different partners that can be involved in this in order to build, to enable students not only to acquire the foundational skills that they need to be able to reskill and upskill later, but also what we would call attitudes for lifelong learning, because we've seen that these are very much related, like motivation, perseverance, self-efficacy. These are very much related to their cognitive outcomes as well, and to their expectations in terms of, for instance, of in tertiary education or retraining throughout life. So building this very early on in cooperating with a range of partners at the stage already of initial education is very important.
I love how we ended this conversation. It's a lot of food for thought for the audience, right? We're confirming on all levels that it is a public-private partnership, but it also incorporates all of us stepping up and taking responsibility, right? It's not one agency, one department, one person. And we're all fighting for the future of the next generation post-COVID. We have no idea what it's going to look like. So many barriers between the digital divide, funding sources drying up right before our eyes. So this is such a needed conversation. I would love to encourage everybody to continue having this conversation with us, either on Twitter or on LinkedIn, as well as Facebook. And please reach out to us. We're here, we're doing the work day in and day out. We've chosen these purpose-driven careers. So I want to really encourage the audience to get engaged with us and give us your perspectives as well. Just a quick thank you to my panelists. Thank you so much for making this time. This is not the fun work that we all want to be doing, but it's the needed work, right? So leading with empathy first. Being the one to speak up, come up with the ideas, get them funded, get the research out there, and really challenging us to think through different perspectives. So I really want to thank you guys, and I'm honored to be moderating this panel with you all. And yeah, so thank you all so much. Please have an incredible day. And yeah, thank you.
Thank you, Sheila. Thanks, OECD.
Thanks, everyone.
Thanks, bye.
Thank you.
Bye.